Turning now to criminal justice reform here in Michigan. We spend more money on prisons than higher education, you know that, and we have a high incarceration rate. There's a lot that goes into those numbers. And just 2 weeks ago, the governor signed off on 18 bills that try to reduce repeat offenders and create more rehabilitation programs. It's a start at trying to change the way we look at prison and the racial disparity of who is behind bars.
Nationwide, 2.3 million people are penned up. More people behind bars than any country on earth. It's estimated that 1 in 8 men in the USA have been convicted of something. The way it's going, 1 in 3 African American men can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. Remember the 1980s? How about mandatory minimums? That was the Reagan era. Then came Bill Clinton, who, along with all those other politicians, prosecutors, sheriffs, and judges, decided to get tough on crime.
My privilege to sentence you to life in prison without parole.
Annually, it costs $80 billion to keep all those people in prison. Such a big operation, there's a name for it. Call it the PIC, the Prison Industrial Complex. But let's talk about Michigan, where we have the DOC, the Department of Corrections. The DOC runs 31 prisons across the state. Back in 1973, we had less than 8,000 prisoners. Now we're at 42,000, and we spend $2 billion a year keeping them there. That's $1 of every 5 coming out of the state's general fund. What could you do with all that cash? You could send every Detroit public school student to Wayne State University, full ride for 3 years. That prison population has to come down. But how? In Lansing, they've been working on something called presumptive parole, or as some want to call it, safe and smart parole reform. That lets more prisoners out sooner, those who've overstayed their mandatory minimums and haven't caused too much trouble doing that time. Parole reform has bipartisan support. Conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats together, they agree, but it's not clear sailing yet. Our governor seems to like it, but our attorney general doesn't. Neither do lots of prosecutors and county sheriffs, who say if more ex-cons hit the streets, crime goes up, and their cash-strapped agencies will have way too big a workload. Then when a parolee commits a terrible crime, it'll be all over the news, and then they'll blame the reformers, who they say never should have let the bad guy out. The reformers know this, but they're holding firm on their position. Progressives see it as a basic human decency. Conservatives say it's the Christian thing to do. And all of them want to save some tax dollars. But the politicians might kick that can down the road again, keeping more prisoners in the can, each one of them costing $35,000 a year.
It's breaking the cycle of incarceration for people that often proves difficult. Poverty and education play big roles. Yusef Shakur is an author, he's an educator, and a community leader here in Detroit. He also served 9 years in prison and says there's a different way we need to look at why so many people are behind bars and can't create a new life when they get out. You know, when we talk about mass incarceration and specifically looking at the state of Michigan, do you think that we even really take in all of the factors that lead to the high prison population in terms of economic factors and education? Have we gathered all of those, or is there still more that we're missing?
Absolutely. When you look at the history, particularly the state of Michigan, up to the early 90s, there was close to only 10 prisons in Michigan. You had this prison bloom from 10 prisons to almost 60 prisons. And where did this population come from? Particularly from urban areas. And so when we do the math, where they're paying close to $40,000 for each inmate for every year, just imagine what that $40,000 would look like if we just did it instead of the back end, the front end, investing within our community. It's simple mathematics of really caring and really digging into the problem and wanting to make human beings better.
So what do we need to invest in our communities so we're not now investing on the back end when people are coming out of prison?
We need to stop taking the approach of being tough on crime. This whole tough on crime is really about scaring people, and it's about creating more prisons, more police. And in reality, if you talk to any honest police officer, they'll tell you, more police is not necessarily going to solve it. We have to take a community approach, and the community approach is sustaining the economic opportunities within our communities. Crime exists in our community for the most part because of the fact there's no economic opportunities, and also the lack of human development. If we improve human development, tie that in with economic opportunities, that decreases crime. And you don't have to go to Harvard to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. When you're working with young people, in your community, in your neighborhood right now, what are they telling you, and what are you trying to help them do or change in their lives so they don't end up on a certain path?
The biggest message, they're angry. The biggest message is that they've been left for dead. You know, they're in the jungle, and as a result, they've been manufactured into being wolves. And so, in the result of the low social skills that they have, you know, robbing, stealing, not caring becomes a way of life. And this way of life is a direct result of being ignorant. And there's nothing wrong with being ignorant. It only means not to know. But when you make ignorance a way of life, then it contributes to a ability to find yourself in prison, the ability to be killed. But this is what you've been inherited. You know, for me, I met my father in prison for the first time. And, you know, it was my grandmother had wanted my name to be Hope like hell, I don't turn like my daddy. And unfortunately, I did. But the other fortunate thing was because of him, I was able to redeem myself in prison because he had redeemed himself.
You know, people talk about we need policies and we need prison reform, corrections reform. Do you find that the policies are meeting where the need is? Are we talking too much about what happens when people come out of prison before, as opposed to what happens before people even get there?
Absolutely. I mean, for one, it's a top-down approach. Two, it's putting a Band-Aid on the gunshot wound. I mean, fundamentally, if we're going to have true policy, quote-unquote reform, we need the mothers, we need the fathers, we need the folks who are directly impacted by it. Again, when you look at the social levees of our communities, when they collapse, the floodgates open up in terms of people turning on each other, and folks just kind of sat on the periphery, and then we're going to send the police and lock everybody up. Lock everybody up has put us in the position that we're in. The fact that, you know, you have more people locked up in this country than anywhere else in the world. And in reality, many of those people are coming home. And when they come home, what are they coming home to? So we have to be, it has to be a duality. And then the statistic says my son faces a high probability of going to prison. So then this is the continued perpetuation of it, and the fact that we have people, whether in the politicians, schools, business, they don't care. And it's simple. If you care, and that young man or that family, as you care about your own, we can create the remedies that's needed.
What about coming out? How difficult is it for people to come back out, try to start a life over again, and then we see a high rate of people going right back into the system?
Recidivism is very high because the fact that there's no rehabilitation for the most part that takes place in prison. Except for if a prisoner takes it upon himself to begin to prepare him or herself to come home.
Do you feel that you had any kind of rehabilitation in prison?
My father. If it wasn't for my father, I would have came home still lost, still confused, and found myself contributing back into my community in a negative way. And so coming home, I mean, in reality, I came home 16 years ago. This conversation we having wasn't in the forefront. So I'll use the example around the movie, the X-Men. And when we look at the X-Men, we look at Charles Xavier and them, and we put them on a pedestal, but we forget about the other mutants that's hiding somewhere, that has been cast away, that's been thrown away, and those are the ones that we have to reach. And there's so many prisoners, there's so many families, formerly incarcerated men and women, who make up more of that population, who are afraid, who have this stigma of shame of who I am. And also, again, my son, this is what he inherits. And so the pathway of prison is rooted in that continuation of perpetuating the mentality that prison is our only fix.
And Yusuf, talk to me about what he tells his son. You can see our whole interview at MiWeek.org. And Yusuf's story is part of our documentary, Pathways to Prison, which is airing tonight at 9:30 p.m. right here on Detroit Public TV. And I want to explore now even further the changes that we could see at the federal level when it comes to the numbers of people incarcerated. We now have a U.S. Attorney General who wants to go back to the war on drugs and tough on crime eras of the 80s and 90s, prosecuting more guns and drugs cases. Those policies sent a lot of low-level drug offenders to prison and hit minority communities. And I want to start with you, Nolan, and say, what is the danger of going back and what Jeff Sessions
I guess
is now
I don't
proposing?
understand what you mean by going back. We've never stopped. We spend upwards of $50 billion a year on the drug war. That hasn't abated. We haven't cut back at all, despite the fact that we haven't come anywhere close to winning it. We haven't made any impact. If you want to get drugs today in your community, you can still go out and get drugs. It's been a mindless war that's been going on for 40 years now, and it's perpetuated by this law and order mentality that pervades amongst our politicians, and they never stop and assess the effectiveness. I think we've reached a point where we should admit defeat and say, we're going to spend a good chunk of that money on treatment and decriminalize almost every drug.
That is a pretty radical.
Well, so what if are we keeping drugs away from people?
You're going to decriminalize every drug?
Are we keeping drugs away from people by criminalizing them? No. People get the drugs they want. And when they can't, they go and
you want to make cocaine readily, legally available?
I do, because the more you try to restrict drugs like cocaine, even heroin, people simply turn to meth, which is just as destructive, perhaps more so. You can't keep people away from their vices. So let's control the distribution and the production and focus on treatment. We spend all that money.
Wow, you just took this down an entirely different role. I was talking about mandatory sentences for low-level drug crimes that have incarcerated people for a very long time.
These shouldn't be crimes.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm going to let you get a crack at this, Nancy, while I recover.
I wasn't ready to go down this road either. No, I mean, we have been he's right, the war on drugs has been in full swing. We have taken tentative steps away toward drug courts that try to understand addiction and try to work with people. Right. You know, and this whole new stance of the federal government could reverse all that. You know, I think we have to ask ourselves, what's the point of prison? Is it to lock people up forever? Or is it, as I think we all believe it to be, an opportunity to pay a debt to society for a crime and then emerge with a new start? That's sort of the concept behind prison, right? And that's not how it works. It's essentially, you know, this revolving door. We sentence people to really long sentences for minor crimes that aren't violent.
That's the point of this package that we talked about in that tape. These are some of the most important bills that have come through the legislature in a long time. They do focus on getting people ready to get out of prison and not come back. Also shorten prisons. I mean, I always quote the old prison director whose name, her name escapes me, but we got to decide who we're afraid of as a society and who we're simply mad at, and in choosing who to lock up.
Right, go ahead.
With regards to the whole Jeff Sessions stance toward policing, I'm from Alabama. I'm a quote an Alabama political columnist who I follow about Jeff Sessions. Like, here's the Alabamification of America. Like, America, would you like to be like Alabama? Because this is what is going on here. Like, this is, I love the place I'm from, but it is not a great model for how to run a state, a society, or a government.
Well, we're going to need to follow the moves that he makes. And Nolan, we're going to have to do a larger segment on what you're talking about. I didn't mean to say, well, we're not going to talk about that, but I think I think it's a very interesting, because then do you then have other crimes that occur because of the drug use or the legal drug use that you have?
The point is, you're not cutting drug use with this drug war. Well, so those crimes are already being committed.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Nancy, you're going to have to come back for this. That's going to do it for MiWeek. You can always read Nancy Kaffer in the Detroit Free Press. Just a few reminders for you. Our documentary, Pathways to Prison, what we're talking about, is on tonight, Thursday, April 13th, 9:30 p.m. right here on Detroit Public TV. And education is also something we talk a lot about here on MiWeek. Tonight, we have a full program devoted to looking at closing the achievement gap here in Michigan. Take a look.
2 years ago, Dr. Lubeski's school was labeled a high achievement gap school.
I called our district office and I said, "Are you sure? Has the state made an error?"
They've been told you have a high achievement gap in your school and you should be the ones to fix it.
I said, "Okay, now what do I need to do?"
Follow Dr. Lubeski on her journey to confront questions, find answers, and discover strength in numbers.
By people who are not addicted.
All right, well, so we're still debating. We've just set up a whole evening of viewing for you. You can check both of those programs out also online at DPTV.org. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again next Thursday for MiWeek. I'm telling you, we're going to do a whole show on this.